Let's talk about the major properties used in algebra. These are used all the time when you're solving things, but you may or may not always recognize what you're doing. But it's good to be able to explain yourself and say that I've used, for instance, the commutative property to solve this problem. So there are 8 major properties we just want to talk about. The commutative property, I think about commuting is when you're driving a car, so this is when things move, but they're still equal to each other. So for instance, with the addition property that's commutative, we have a plus b equals b plus a. So the a and the b switch places, but that doesn't matter when you're adding them together. They would have the same value. Like 2 plus 3 is 5, so is 3 plus 2. It doesn't matter which order we put them. The same goes for multiplication. If we have a times b or b times a, it wouldn't make a difference. Again, 2 times 3 is 6, and 3 times 2 is still 6. The next major property is the associative property. So when we're adding, think about associating is when things are grouped together. Like when you associate with people, you're usually in a group of people for some reason. So we have a plus b plus c, where b plus c is grouped together. It would not make a difference if we regrouped it as a plus b plus c. Notice in the associative property, things are not moving except for the grouping symbol. So in the commutative property, terms actually move, but the statements stay equal. But in the associative property, things are regrouped, but they still stay equal. In multiplying, it works the same way. A times b times c is equivalent to a times b times c. So even though we regroup them, they're all still multiplying together, and it doesn't matter what order they're in. For the identity property, think about what you start with doesn't change. We don't change the identity by adding 0 to something. So a plus 0 would still equal a. Then we also don't change the identity when we multiply by 1. So a times 1 is still just a. For the inverse property, the additive inverse makes something come out as 0 because you're adding the opposite of that something. So a plus negative a would add up to 0. And then the multiplicative inverse, it's called, is when you multiply by the reciprocal, and it'll come out to equal 1. So inverse adds to equal 0 or multiplies to equal 1. That's different than the identity. People get those confused because they're both about the same size word. They both start with an I. So identity, remember, keeps the same identity. And then inverse, you are doing something to add up to 0 or to multiply to get 1. So a times the reciprocal of a, which is 1 over a, would multiply to give me 1. One of our favorite properties we use all the time, and we're going to use more this year, is distributive. Distributive means you have to distribute something to a group of things. So a times b plus c is equivalent to a times b plus a times c. Usually that's a pretty simple one because it looks very unique compared to the other properties. Substitution we also use a lot with algebra. We have to substitute sometimes. So if they give us a equals 3, for instance, we could say a plus b is equivalent to 3 plus b, because now we have the value of a that we could substitute for a. And where many more examples would fit there, we're just going to look at that one for now. For reflexive, this one is when something is exactly equal to itself. A equals a, 4y equals 4y. We could keep going, but again, those are 2 nice, simple examples of reflexive properties. So it's when you have exactly the same thing equal to itself. Transitive property is also very different from the other properties. This is if they give you a equals b, for instance, and b equals c, we can automatically say a would equal c, because if a equals b and b equals c, it would make sense to conclude a would also equal to c. So that's the one that's kind of a chain reaction. It sounds like, well, something happens here and then something happens there. So the first one and the third one would connect with logic. So these are our 8 main properties we use a lot in algebra. We need to have some good notes so that when we have to explain how we solved an equation, or later on in Math 2 or Math 3, you might have to have some of these properties help you with a proof.